The element of the love story is that she loved him and she wanted him to be happy. I think that the real pact between them was he had turned her into the most hated woman in the world, and so he spent his life trying to compensate for that, buying her jewels, adoring her, feting her in every way he could. And she felt this tremendous seam of guilt that she was responsible for the King of England giving up his throne, and so her compensation was to make that worthwhile. And I would say that towards the very end of their life, they would both agree that that had been worthwhile, and that they were united as one. But I wonder if the cost they had to pay for that was too high.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward. It has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak, but you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. We all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Everyday life in the early 20th century was very dynamic. The 19th century, the 100-year period before the advent of the 20th century, was marked by great social, political, economic change. Britain became an industrial society.
I think there was a much stronger moral code, a far greater respect and reverence for the monarchy, and a sense that people led a much more ordinary and disciplined life in a way.
There's a large working class. They are increasingly frustrated because they want greater political power. They haven't achieved that until 1918. It's also the case that after the First World War, Britain falls into a depression as a result of the Wall Street crash, which emanates from New York. This plunges many ordinary people into dire poverty. Again, they turn to the extremes. They look to communism, fascism for answers. This is a moment of grave peril for the British monarchy.
There was a general sense also that Britain was no longer great. There was a sense of the days of empire, the days that people could be certain of Britain's place in the world had rather elapsed. And so when George V became king, there was a real sense that rebirth was needed and that there was a new kind of monarchy that people were looking for.
While we can say that George V was definitely a good king, we cannot say that he was a good father. Freda Dudley Ward said that you could never blame Edward for his problems because he had had such a terrible time at the hands of his parents. And George and Mary were incredibly old-fashioned Edwardian parents, believing that children should be seen, even rarely, and not heard.
And if we look at it now, we'd almost regard it as abusive because we look at the idea that these children were being treated in ways that were not humane and were not kind. But on the other hand, back then, there was no concept of kindness as we understand it today.
So it was an incredibly authoritarian, disciplined, cold, emotionally unrewarding childhood. It's really interesting that Edward said of his childhood that Christmas was Dickens in a Cartier setting. And I think that really sums it up, that while they had the trappings of wealth and incredible luxury, there was tremendous neglect. And even when the family had no visitors, in the evening they would dress for dinner in full regalia, in tiaras, in diamonds, but there was no emotional warmth. The children were educated by pretty mediocre governesses and tutors, and Edward later said that he had a curious type of loneliness.
Growing up, Edward was a different kind of royal to what had come before. He knew that there was increased media attention focusing on him, also what was going on in terms of his private life, and he knew he had a role to play, that he was expected to perform. He was a lively, excitable young person, driven by change, interested in new things. He saw the 20th century as this great opportunity, and in that respect, very different from what had come before.
Edward VIII is quite a difficult man to really pin down. At the end of writing my book about the Windsors, I was still conflicted about him. In many ways, he was very spoilt, he was very indulged. He was the opposite of his father, who, had duty inbred in every pore, whereas with Edward, duty was drilled into him, which he really resented. So he wanted to be more spontaneous. He definitely was more modern.
He was excited by change and innovation. As a man, he engaged in lots of outdoor pursuits, things like flying, golf, skiing, swimming. He was a real sort of showman in that respect. It was also the case that he enjoyed sort of the fast life and nightclubs and partying. He'd go out socializing, drinking with his brothers. He also enjoyed the company of women. He had a number of extramarital affairs. He was the bad boy prince, but he was loved by the public.
Wallis Simpson came from a very well-bred American family. I quite loved it that later in life Diana Mosley said, she was so much better bred than Grace Kelly, another famous American export. She was very well educated. She went to a very good all-girls school, Oldfields in Baltimore. And she was very well read. She was very, very bright, Wallis. Her father died when she was a baby and her mother was a single mother, and her childhood was difficult. She absolutely adored her mother. But they were very much at the mercy of her mother's brother, Uncle Sol, who was a very dictatorial, difficult, demanding man. The reason I think that Wallis married incredibly young was because she felt that she would have a form of financial security, and that would be a relief for her mother. And in fact, this fear of penury dogged her all her life, and people said that it even infected the Prince of Wales. And I think her fear of not having enough absolutely informed why at the end of her life she changed her will and left everything to the Louis Pasteur Institute in France at the behest of this satanic lawyer, Maitre Bloom, who terrified her and said, if you don't leave everything to the French, you will be evicted from your house in France. And this stemmed right back to her childhood, which was one of financial insecurity. But she was well educated, well bred, and well brought up.
Wallis was a great horse rider, but she was also a great sort of society hostess. She was great at putting on parties. She was a great fan of the cinema. She aspired to a kind of Hollywood glamour in the way that she looked, and I think she was besotted, certainly in the 10s and 20s, the new emergent form of media, which was Hollywood cinema.
What's so fascinating about Wallis Simpson is the perceived narrative now is that she was some sort of femme fatale and she was a racy figure and she manipulated the Prince of Wales and she was sort of sexually adventurous. When the reality was she was actually very prudish, very conservative in the way she dressed, in her bearing, in her being, in the sense that she wasn't sexually adventurous.
Wallis Simpson is, I think, one of the most vilified women of the 20th century, most of which I think is dictated by misogyny, pure and simple. I think that the idea of a strong, confident woman who was forging her own path in the world was seen with absolute terror by people who didn't like the idea of this person who couldn't be kept down, wasn't answerable to anyone, didn't belong to the British codes of conduct.
Wallis and Edward first met in 1931 at a high society party at Borough Court in Melton Mowbray. Initially, Edward was still involved with other women, and Wallis was still married to Ernest Simpson at this point in time. So there was no initial romance. It wouldn't be until the start of 1934, when the two met again, that an amorous relationship started to build. I think Wallis, to some extent, found a soulmate. He was a bon vivant. He lived well, he lived fast, he enjoyed the high life. He loved new technologies, he traveled widely, he partied hard. These are things that appealed to Wallis. It was also the case that he could offer her a kind of lifestyle that she wasn't necessarily getting from her husband at the time.
So rather like Edward VIII, she was a woman ahead of her time. She could not see why or how she should remain in a marriage that was abusive.
So in that respect, he represented a kind of security as well. It was also the case that Edward had a great sense of humour. He was well known for being able to tell good jokes around the dinner table, and I think she admired that in him as well. Perhaps also there was something of a lost soul. Edward has been widely portrayed by biographers and historians as someone lacking a sense of direction, and I think to some extent she felt that she could offer him that sense of direction. When she first got involved with Edward, some saw her as essentially as a gold-digging figure, interested in tapping into Edward's wealth and power. Others saw her as just Edward's most recent craze. They didn't take her particularly seriously. But as it became clear that he was besotted with her, they saw that she really meant a great deal to him. And in that respect, I think they were happy also for the king, that particular group of people.
I think what was terribly difficult for the British public was, of course, they knew nothing about Wallis and Edward's relationship. They just saw their beloved king, you know, with his flaxen hair going about his duties. Whereas within the establishment and within society, everybody knew about their relationship. And I think that one of the cruelest aspects of history in this respect is that everybody in the Prince of Wales and Mrs. Simpson's circle who met Mrs. Simpson really liked her and really admired her and could see what a good influence she was on the king. However, it was the unholy trinity, as I call them, of palace, parliament and church who did not want Edward on the throne, and in my opinion, Mrs. Simpson became the suitable scapegoat for that. Through that process, she developed a very strong interior life when she had to live with the knowledge that she knew who she was, her close friends knew who she was, and I've read lots of those letters, and they adored her, and the rest of the world would never know. Now that takes tremendous resilience, inner resource and strength. And Edward never found that strength, that inner strength, so he was constantly relying on her to bolster him up, to make him feel better, to be his mother figure, his lover, his wife, his best friend. I mean, the demands on her emotionally were enormous. So within their society circle, there was a sense of acceptance that this was the woman that the Prince of Wales had chosen, and they could see a beneficial influence. The public were kept out of the picture. They knew nothing because there was a press moratorium, press blackout on it, and there was this absolute rage and sense of revolt in the palace and partly in Parliament and certainly within the church. Possibly the most sexually shocking fact about Wallis Simpson is that on the eve of her wedding to Edward, she told the man who gave her away, Herman Rogers, that neither of her previous husbands had ever touched her below her personal Mason-Dixon line. So, which seems to imply that she was, she was not exactly a virgin, but she hadn't had sexual intercourse. And this was because what was a source of great secret shame and embarrassment to Wallis was that she was what's known now as intersex, where you have both the male and female organs, but very, very small. And it's likely that a full sexual relationship would have been quite difficult for her. And I think that one of the things that united Wallis and Edward was they both had sexual insecurities. And of course, we can't know what goes on at 2 o'clock in the morning, lying in bed between a couple. But I think it's fair to say that they somehow understood each other.
When it became clear that Edward was thinking about abdicating the throne in order to marry Wallis Simpson, there was an enormously mixed reaction. You could essentially summarise it like this. The middle classes were horrified and disgusted because they saw that the king having this relationship with a married woman, indeed a divorced woman, something that was completely unacceptable. The working classes didn't think anything of this. They thought it was absolutely fair enough, that they loved the king, they wanted him to be happy, and they were very, very keen that he remain on the throne. So it really split the country down the middle, and of course the upper classes were faced with this completely different idea, whereby they didn't condemn him from a moral perspective, they condemned him more from a perspective of being selfish enough to having put the country in this constitutional crisis.
Opposed to the popular ruler's desire to marry Mrs. Wallis Simpson, strides Premier Stanley Baldwin. No marriage to Mrs. Simpson, Stanley Baldwin says, speaking for the British government. Here he is in typical action.
Government is a great idea.
Today in Britain's new crisis, the Premier proves that he has lost no force.
This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward. At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own. I have never wanted to withhold anything. But until now, it has not been constitutionally possible for me to speak. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. And now we all have the new king. I wish him and you, his people, happiness and prosperity with all my heart. God bless you all. God save the king.
Even the whole sense of theatre leading up to it, he was driven down the long drive, the long walk at Windsor. He went to his old suite of rooms at Windsor and sat behind his desk. And what he delivered was heartfelt. What he was saying is, I love this woman so much, I simply cannot exist without her. I won't be an effective king without her, whereas my brother has this very loyal wife and will be a better king. And I think there's great dignity in his abdication speech. And I think that the reason it resonated so hugely the world over and has done, you know, for the last 80 years, is because he spoke from the heart and he spoke his truth. And that was a very non-British, non-royal thing to do.
When he made his abdication speech from Windsor Castle on the evening of 11th December 1936, people were listening to it all over the country and they were weeping. It was a huge national moment because no king had ever abdicated before. And the fact that he was doing so for love, or at least what appeared to be love, made people feel this was a great sentimental passion. And I think what it did, and I think that there's always been a romantic way of looking at the abdication crisis, is that Edward had acted in a way that, on the one hand, was appallingly entirely selfish, but on the other hand, it was a way that has torn up centuries of precedent. All of his forebears had essentially known that to be king was something that you did as a duty, your personal feelings didn't really matter. So what he said was actually, no, my feelings and my happiness are more important than my being king. So I think people responded to that, and I think that the public had this sympathy for him.
The greatest myth about Wallis Simpson is that it's been convenient for history to paint her as the wicked witch in this and the woman that pushed for abdication. That is the biggest lie. There is absolute concrete evidence from her friends, from her letters, from her own memoir, that she absolutely did not want the king to abdicate, that she begged him not to abdicate, that she was desperate to, as she said, slip away and fold my tent. And when she tried to escape him prior to the abdication and say, look, you know, please don't do this, I shall watch you from afar, you can be an effective king. Essentially, he said, wherever you go in the world, I shall follow you. And just prior to the abdication, one of his courtiers said he was exalté to the point of madness, and at this point was sleeping with a loaded pistol under his pillow. And he literally emotionally blackmailed Wallis and said, if you leave me, I shall kill myself. And there was a really real possibility of that. He was so unhinged at this stage. And she just couldn't risk that. So she could not escape. But for anyone to say that Wallis Simpson wanted to be queen, that she wanted Edward to abdicate, is an utter falsehood. It's a really interesting question, was the abdication a difficult decision for Edward? Because in one sense it wasn't a difficult decision at all, because the thing that he was most clear about was that he could not be an effective king without the support of the woman he loved, and that this relationship meant more to him than anything. It meant more than the monarchy, you know, his seat at the throne, all of that. However, for a man like that who'd been brought up in that household, obviously to abdicate was the most seismic, devastating event. And I think he genuinely felt terrible at letting the people who loved him down. I don't think it was a question of he felt guilt at betraying the palace or Parliament, because I think he felt they had betrayed him, actually. So it's a complex answer. In the one sense, because he was so heart-led, it wasn't a difficult decision because his heart led the way. But I think in his head, obviously, there must have been conflict. And he loved his brother, and he knew the strain he was then going to be putting onto his brother. But as he said, Bertie was a better mould of king. He was going to be more dutiful. He had a more stoic, traditional wife in Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. And in fact, Edward didn't cause collapse in the country. It was better for the country that he wasn't king. But for me, it's incredibly tragic because, as we saw when he was governor of the Bahamas, I truly believe that had he been allowed to have Wallace by his side, he would have been a better king.
After the abdication, Edward left Britain for Europe. He travelled to Austria. He had to wait 6 months to be reunited with Wallace, and that was because Wallace's divorce had to be finalised.
When Edward and Wallace were finally reunited at the Château Condé in France, it's really very moving. I mean, he just rushed up the steps to be with her, and they were so tender at that stage because it really was them against the world.
The British press go wild. They've followed this story. They've waited for this moment of reunion, and there are front page photographs and headlines celebrating the fact that these two lovers are back together again.
Greatest headlines of the century. Dateline, London, December 11th, 1936. In a moment, the story.
The ancient French city of Tours gives the Reverend R.A. Jardine of Darlington, England, a royal send-off as he rushes to the picturesque Chateau de Conde, near here, to conduct the marriage ceremony for the Duke of Windsor. He's accompanied by Sir Walter Monckton and A.J. Allen, the Duke's legal advisors. Their arrival at the gates of the Chateau Park finds a small army of photographers and newspapermen besieging the entrance, preparing to flash to the four corners of the globe the climax of the royal love story that has gripped the world. A great crowd has gathered here, too, to toast the bride and groom when word of the completion of the ceremony reaches the castle gate. Now, the present photographers are allowed into the grounds, and so we proceed through the peaceful sylvan scenes, scenes ideally suited to royal romance, to the ancient chateau, with its historic towers and its impressive atmosphere. Only a select few witness the ceremony. And there, now, the Duke and Duchess coming out on the chateau steps. Edward and his American bride, the woman for whose love he gave away an empire. Theirs has been called the greatest romance in history, and its climax here in this secluded spot is in vivid contrast to the pomp that might have been. But they're supremely happy at last, after months of difficulties. The silent, almost lifeless grounds of Conde at this critical moment in Edward's life recall to mind the glittering coronation pageantry of last month in London. But Edward staked his crown on love and won, the partner of his heart's desire. So they're happy now amid their closest friends.
Edward and Wallace got married in May 1937 at the Château de Condé, which was owned by Charles Bedaux. And Walter Monckton, who had been an advisor of Edward during and after the abdication crisis, attended the wedding, and he was one of the very few people who did. And Monckton said of the wedding that it was a very strange, very sad wedding for somebody who had previously been King Emperor. The reason why it was so strange and so small was that it wasn't a royal wedding in any conventional sense. There were a handful of guests. The priest who was conducting it was this renegade priest from Darlington who'd come down and styled himself the King's Vicar. And it was a very strange event where journalists were there in their hundreds outside the chateau, but it was just all rather tawdry and all rather pathetic. And it was very much the sense that if you see pictures of it today, there's about a dozen guests and that's it. There was a real abiding feeling of desolation, of it not being what anyone could have wanted. But of course, Edward was so happy to be married to Wallis that he ignored the fact that none of his family were there, that very few of his friends were there, that it was being covered by the papers like a kind of freak show. But I think Wallis, at this stage, had realised that her life was going to be difficult. She'd realised that she was always going to be on show and on parade.
She had become the most hated woman in the world.
But what happened immediately after the abdication was that it was decided that Edward could not remain in Britain any longer, because it was felt that having an ex-king in his own country created a situation that was both rife with constitutional issues, but it was also difficult from a perspective of how he would be regarded, because there was always a fear of Edward having a kind of rival court, because there was such public sympathy towards him.
One of the most difficult things for Edward and Wallis is that he had abdicated, but he couldn't go straight to Wallis's arms. Because she was in the process of waiting for her decree absolute to come through from her divorce from Ernest Simpson, there was a period of separation when they couldn't be together. And Wallis was in France, and Edward went to stay in a schloss in Austria. It's kind of unfathomable now to think about it, but when he left England on this, this naval destroyer from Portsmouth, he hadn't really factored where he was going to go or how his life was going to be without the panoply of a royal staff and his entourage. So it's a kind of haunting image of him on the naval destroyer with his dog Slipper, very much alone, and he couldn't be united with the one woman who gave him comfort and succour. So during this time, he was in Austria and Wallis was in France. And this is the period when the letters between them are the most heartbreaking and revelatory, really. Wallis has had to accept that the abdication has happened and everything that means for her, and Edward is trying to reassure her that all will be well. And for me, the most devastating, just heartbreaking event that happened is that when their relationship became very serious, Edward bought Wallis a Cairn Terrier called Slipper, and this dog became their kind of substitute child. And while Wallis was in France waiting for Edward to join him pre their wedding, Edward, who'd had the dog in Austria, decided to send the dog to Wallis because she was missing him so much. And on the first evening that the dog arrived, with Edward's equerry had brought him, Wallis took the dog out for a walk, and the dog, Slipper, was bitten by a viper and died. And it's at this point in their correspondence, and really everything that they'd been through, that they'd been holding on so tightly, that the dam of their grief breaks, and their letters are absolutely heartbreaking. They are saying the principal guest at our wedding is no more, they can't stop crying, they feel completely and utterly undone by the death of this dog. And I really understand that, because they'd held themselves together so tightly. They'd been through this seismic historical event and everything that that entailed, and the death of this dog broke the dam of their grief. What is really telling is that Wallis said, I'm going to have the Slipper buried in the grounds of the chateau where she was staying. And Edward said, no, don't do that. I'm going to have a special lead-lined casket made, and we will have Slipper taken back to the canine burial ground at Fort Belvedere, his home, what had been his home in England. Now, what this shows is that at the time of the abdication, it never occurred to him that after a suitable cooling off period, he wouldn't be allowed to return to England, to Britain, to live the life of the brother of the king and to have Wallis with him back in Britain. I think that's extremely telling. And as you discover, that was not to be the case. But I think it's really important to realise that he did not think that the abdication meant that he was going to be exiled from the country he loved for the rest of his life. After the war, Edward and Wallis lived this sort of peripatetic life of moving between various homes in France, travelling to America. They lived the life of the gilded jet set, but with a laminated form of grief. It wasn't really the life that either of them wanted. And Wallis was very well aware that she now had this man who had been King of England, and that there was no role for them really. And so she almost made these little principalities around him. That the decor of the houses was very kind of regal, and she tried to, every day she put a schedule out on the table in the hall, a printed schedule, because that's what he's had as King and Prince of Wales. And it's pathetic because it was literally things like 11 o'clock, play golf, or whomever was coming to lunch. So it was a sad, empty existence. However, what I will say is people often ask, well, was this a great love affair or was it a tragedy? And my answer would be both. But towards the end of their life, the more it became us against the rest of the world, it then became a genuine love affair, and they relied on each other. And what I think is so touching is that towards the end of his life, Edward said that he did not have one breath of regret about what had happened, because every day he was so happy to be with Wallis. His obsessional but devotional love for her is something that I cannot comprehend. I cannot comprehend 36 years of marriage to someone and to be that infatuated by them every single day.
Well, after the abdication, Wallis Simpson was regarded as somebody who was dangerous. She was regarded as the woman who had destroyed the king, the woman who had brought down Edward VIII, and she was seen as somebody who was not worth bothering with. And Edward was a much more dangerous figure in terms of his politics, in terms of his associations, but she was damned by association. She was somebody who was never received again socially in Britain. She was somebody who, in America, the country of her birth, was essentially regarded as like somebody out of a freak show. And she knew all this. I mean, she was an intelligent woman. She was somebody who understood what the lines of fashion were, what the lines of society were, and that she was being regarded in this incredibly negative way. And I think she resented it on a personal level, but she never made any reference to any of this stuff. She just smiled and dressed fantastically and soaked up the slings and arrows of abuse that were directed towards her.
The last few years of Edward's life, he was, yes, he was quite ill and quite frail, but I think they were happy years for him. He had Wallis, he had his pugs. You know, according to Joanna Schutz, who was there with the Windsors during those last years, there was such a strong sense of devotion between them. I mean, every morning, Edward's waking words are, "Is the Duchess awake? Can I see her?" She was his everything. So even though he knew he was fading, he still had the love of the woman that meant so much to him. However, he also did have quite a lot of anxiety about what was going to happen to her post his death, because he knew that the royal family probably weren't going to be that nice to her. They didn't have any children, so he relied on his friends, and he told various people that I interviewed that he was concerned about what was going to happen to Wallis because he couldn't offer her protection in death.
In the last years before his death, Edward made a number of trips to the United Kingdom with his wife for events, notably the death of his sister Mary. During these trips, again, there was a lot of media attention on the Windsors. They remained, and he in particular remained a popular figure right through until the end of his life. But he had this image now of a slightly sad-looking figure on the margins of the royal family, of unfulfilled potential in many respects.
I think by the last years of Edward's life, when he had various forms of cancer and he was physically very debilitated, I think that Wallis was, if not a physical help to him, at least a sort of emotional help to him. Because by this stage, they'd been through so much together that they had this companionship of many decades standing. And people who would have dinners or parties with him reported that she would be making an effort for the party to be kept going. In a sense, you can see that even decades after her heyday, she was always somebody who was living by the standards of her era, making sure everyone had the best wine, the best cocktails and so on. But I think that by the end of Edward's life, she knew that when he died, she'd be seen as a very diminished figure, and that's exactly what happened.
The public reaction when he died was split, much as had been the case at the time of the abdication, much as had been the case at the time of his marriage to Wallis. There were some sections of society that really celebrated Edward as a figure that had a great deal of sympathy for what he'd gone through, the fact that he'd had to renounce the throne in order to marry the woman he loved. There were other sections of society that saw him as something of a scoundrel, that had failed in his efforts to put national duty ahead of personal gratification.
When Wallis returned to England for Edward's funeral, which is what he wanted, I think the absolute irony of it was that the royal family gave her everything that would have meant so much to her husband in his life, but in his death she didn't care. So the Queen sent Lord Mountbatten to Heathrow to collect her. I thought it was a very touching detail that the Queen sent outriders and they blocked all the traffic on the drive coming back to Heathrow so that the grieving widow would never be seen at traffic lights and people would just stare in at her. The day before the Duke's funeral was the Trooping of the Colour, and the Queen asked Wallis would she like to go in the state carriage, astonishingly, with the Queen Mother. And Wallis said no. I mean, it was too little too late. It would have given her husband so much pleasure, but she didn't care about any of that. What she wanted was for him to have been acknowledged and for them both to have been acknowledged in his lifetime. So I think one of the most tragic photographs is the photograph of the Duchess of Windsor looking out of the window at Buckingham Palace over the Trooping of the Colour, and there is such pain etched into her face, and she looks so lonely because she was alone when she was amongst the royal family, and she knew she had to go through this because it's what Edward had decreed. All the funeral arrangements he'd agreed with the Queen at a prior event, so she had to honour her husband's wishes. But I mean, it would have been unbearable for her. And then the very sad figure of the grieving widow going up the steps. The Queen had kindly sent one of her private aircrafts to fly Wallis home, and she walks up those steps alone, and you know she's returning to a life in Paris alone.